December 1944. As Allied leaders pause along what they think is a quiet front, almost 200,000 German soldiers, bolstered by elite SS Panzer divisions and desperate dreams, are about to turn the frozen Ardennes into a last gamble. Hitler bets everything on the Battle of the Bulge, convinced he can split the Allies, seize Antwerp, and force the West to the negotiating table, despite warnings from his own ministers that Germany may last only a year. But buried beneath the snow are fatal flaws: 10 days ammunition, fuel shortages, horse-drawn wagons outnumbering tanks 40-1. Why did this doomed attack catch the Allies off guard? And how close did it come to changing the war's endgame? By the last months of 1944, Germany's war machine was running on borrowed time. Allied armies pressed from both east and west, their lines now pressed up against the borders of the Reich itself. In Berlin, Albert Speer, Minister for Armaments, had already warned that Germany's industrial reserves could not sustain another year of fighting. Allied bombers had pounded factories and railways, and the loss of occupied territories had cut off vital raw materials. Steel production, which had managed 2.5 million tons a month by mid-year, dropped to less than half that by autumn. Explosive and ammunition stocks, once the backbone of the Wehrmacht's firepower, dwindled to a fraction of what was needed. By September, only 20,000 tons of explosives were produced, against a monthly consumption of 70,000 tons, forcing rationing even as demand soared. On the ground, the Wehrmacht's ranks had thinned. The failed summer offensives in Normandy and on the Eastern Front cost tens of thousands of irreplaceable men. The Red Army's advance from the Vistula to the gates of Warsaw had gutted Army Group Center. In the west, the Allies broke out from Normandy, sweeping across France in a matter of weeks. The German army, once built on well-trained, experienced soldiers, now relied on teenage conscripts, older reservists, and men recalled from convalescence. The new Volksgrenadier divisions, raised in haste, often lacked training, equipment, and the morale that had once defined German arms. Inside the Reich, the July 20th plot had failed to kill Hitler, but it left a mark of suspicion and fear. The Gestapo hunted real and imagined conspirators, and the army's independence was broken. Hitler withdrew even further into his circle, refusing to consider advice from his senior commanders. The regime's answer was to demand more from less: total war, total mobilization, and a final, decisive blow in the West. As autumn set in, Hitler's thinking turned increasingly to a single gamble: a strike that could break the Allied coalition. His generals urged caution. Field Marshals von Rundstedt and Model, both veterans of the Western Front, argued for a defensive posture, buying time and conserving what strength remained. Speer's figures showed that the Reich could not replace its losses, and the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. But Hitler was unmoved. He believed that only a dramatic victory could restore the initiative, split the Anglo-American alliance, and force the Allies to the negotiating table. The idea that Germany might collapse within a year, as Speer calculated, only made him more determined to act while any means remained. By early December, Allied lines stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. American and British armies were stalled by supply shortages and the onset of winter, their front lines thin in the Ardennes, a sector considered quiet, manned by units recovering from earlier battles. For Hitler, the moment seemed right. He saw a chance to repeat the surprise of 1940, driving through the Ardennes to the Meuse, then on to Antwerp. The plan called for secrecy, for speed, and for a level of coordination that Germany's battered forces had not managed in years. Yet Hitler's fixation on a knockout blow ignored the warnings from his own ministers and commanders. The Reich's last reserves were scraped together, its last operational tanks and guns sent west. The offensive would be Germany's final throw, a gamble with everything at stake. As the snows deepened over the Ardennes, the stage was set for the last great battle on the Western Front. The German offensive in the Ardennes moved forward with a hidden weakness that no amount of secrecy or hope could overcome. The Wehrmacht had managed to stockpile only about 15,000 tons of artillery ammunition for the entire operation, barely enough for 10 days at the planned rate of fire. German planners calculated they would need at least 1,200 tons per day to support the three attacking armies. Yet the actual tactical demand was often even higher. Once the assault began, these reserves would dwindle fast, leaving divisions to ration shells and prioritize only the most urgent fire missions. Reports of shortages reached headquarters within days, especially from units fighting around Bastogne. Panzer Lehr, one of the best-equipped divisions, was already citing lack of transport for ammunition by December 28th, not a lack of shells in rear depots. The bottleneck was moving supplies forward, not storage at the Rhine. This shortage was the result of a war economy stretched to breaking. Explosives production had collapsed under Allied bombing, falling from 60,000 tons early in 1944 to just 20,000 by September, while the Army's monthly consumption still hovered around 70,000 tons. Shell and casing output hit record highs, but without enough explosive filler, the numbers on paper meant little. By November, the entire German stock of 105mm howitzer ammunition was half that of September 1939, and the number of rounds per gun was less than a third of what it had been at the start of the war. The Führer Reserve, 100 trains loaded with ammunition, waited at the Rhine, but the real challenge was getting those shells to the front through a logistics chain that was already breaking down. The reality on the ground made the limits of German supply painfully clear. Most divisions still relied on horses to move guns and supplies. Out of 264 combat divisions in November 1944, only 42 were armored or motorized. A typical infantry division brought more than 2,600 horses for its supply train, compared to just 256 trucks. Artillery was still largely horse-drawn, which meant that in the winter mud and snow of the Ardennes, movement slowed to a crawl. Even in the panzer divisions, the artillery and logistics elements lagged behind the tanks, creating gaps in fire support and resupply. The result was a force that looked modern from the front, tanks, half-tracks, and assault guns, but was pulled along by an army of horses behind the lines. The contrast with American and British mechanization was stark. While Allied supply columns rolled forward on rubber tires, German convoys stretched out in long, slow-moving lines of wagons, vulnerable to breakdown, congestion, and air attack once the skies cleared. Fuel was another looming crisis. For the Ardennes, Hitler's staff scraped together more than 4 million gallons, roughly equal to what German armies had for the Normandy campaign. But that figure masked a deeper problem. Only about 1.5 to 2 consumption units were available at the front, enough for a single push of less than 100 miles. The rest sat at Rhine railheads, waiting for transport that never came. The plan depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps along the way, an assumption that proved wildly optimistic. American engineers had standing orders to destroy or evacuate fuel stocks at the first sign of a German advance. And the few caches that did fall into German hands were rarely enough to keep more than a handful of tanks moving. Terrain and weather made everything worse. The Ardennes was a maze of narrow, icy roads, and each advance stretched the already thin supply lines further. Horses struggled through snowdrifts and mud, trucks broke down or ran out of gas, and every mile forward meant more time lost to congestion and confusion. The Wehrmacht's own records show that by December 23rd, fuel consumption had already dropped by half as units slowed or halted for lack of gasoline. By then, the offensive was running on fumes, literally and figuratively. The gamble had always depended on speed, surprise, and the hope that the enemy would break before German supplies did. But with every day that passed, the built-in shortages grew more obvious, and the offensive's margin for success narrowed to nothing. Early on December 16th, the Ardennes lay hidden under a thick winter fog, muffling sound and blinding Allied observation posts. At 5:30 a.m., German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile front, shells slamming into American positions from Monschau south to Echternach. In the north, Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army surged forward behind the barrage, aiming its elite panzer divisions at the thinly held American lines near Losheim and Bullingen. The fog, dense enough to ground Allied aircraft, gave the attackers the cover they needed. Columns of tanks and half-tracks moved undetected through forest tracks and narrow roads, headlights blacked out, engines rumbling beneath the trees. But almost immediately, Dietrich's spearheads ran into unexpected resistance. The Elsenborn Ridge, held by the U.S. 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions, blocked the main northern route. Here, American artillery, pre-sighted and firing in coordinated salvos, caught advancing German infantry in open ground. Despite the weight of 4 panzer divisions and hundreds of tanks, the Germans failed to dislodge the defenders. The thick woods and network of only a few passable roads forced German armor into traffic jams. Vehicles stalled bumper to bumper, unable to maneuver or deploy off-road, while engineers struggled to clear mines under fire. By nightfall, the Elsenborn Ridge remained in American hands, and German columns were backed up for miles, their timetables in shreds. The situation looked very different in the center. Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, facing a sector held by green or exhausted American units, found the lines stretched dangerously thin. Here, the fog worked entirely to the Germans' advantage. German infantry infiltrated through gaps in the American front, bypassing strongpoints and cutting telephone wires. By midday, entire U.S. regiments were isolated, their positions overrun or surrounded. At St. Vith, the 106th Infantry Division, barely 2 weeks in the line, collapsed under the weight of the assault, with 2 regiments encircled and forced to surrender. Manteuffel's armoured columns pushed forward up to 20 miles in the first 48 hours, capturing bridges and road junctions that would prove vital for any deeper advance. The contrast between north and centre could not have been sharper. On the roads leading west from the Schnee Eifel, German tanks thundered through abandoned American supply depots, seizing fuel and ammunition left behind in the confusion. Columns of U.S. prisoners trudged east, while scattered American units fell back to form improvised defensive lines. Yet every mile gained in the center added to the congestion behind the German front. The narrow, icy roads, never designed for such traffic, became clogged with tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons. Vehicles slid into ditches or broke down, blocking entire columns. With each hour, the gap between the initial breakthrough and the follow-on echelons widened, straining the offensive's fragile timetable. The weather that had hidden the German buildup now shielded their movements and paralyzed Allied air power. American units, cut off from higher headquarters, reported tanks moving in the fog, enemy patrols appearing out of nowhere, and roads suddenly blocked by German roadblocks. The sense of chaos was palpable in the central sector, where radio silence and broken communication lines left officers relying on rumor and field telephones. In the north, however, the stubborn defense of Elsenborn Ridge meant that Dietrich's best units were already falling behind schedule, their advance lanes choked by wreckage and artillery fire. By the end of December 16th, the battle's momentum was split. Manteuffel's panzers had carved a deep wedge into the American center, overrunning command posts and threatening the vital highway network to Bastogne. Dietrich's SS divisions, slowed by terrain and resistance, found themselves mired in confusion and traffic, unable to break out into open country. The fog that had given the Germans their chance now concealed the first signs that the offensive's pace would never match its ambition. In the southern sector of the Ardennes, Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army faced a very different set of challenges from the armored spearheads advancing further north. The divisions under his command were mostly unmotorized, built around older infantry formations and Volksgrenadier units, with only a thin scattering of armored vehicles for support. Horses outnumbered trucks by more than 10 to 1, and artillery was still largely horse-drawn. The terrain here was less forgiving than in the center. Steep wooded hills, narrow valleys, and twisting icy roads that quickly turned to mud under the weight of supply wagons and marching columns. Brandenberger's orders were clear. Protect the southern flank of the offensive, advance across the Our and Sauer rivers, and tie down as many American units as possible to prevent them from reinforcing the threatened center. But the means to do so were limited. His divisions began the attack using assault boats to cross the rivers before dawn, but most units struggled with the current and the cold, and a shortage of bridging equipment meant that only the leading elements could make it across in the first hours. American cavalry screens, lightly armed but mobile, used hit-and-run tactics, laying down harassing fire and then falling back to new positions, slowing the German advance at every turn. Progress was minimal compared to the ambitious timetable laid out in German plans. The 212th Volksgrenadier Division, for example, gained just a few miles on December 16th and 17th, forced to halt repeatedly as engineers tried to repair damaged bridges under fire. In the hills south of Clairvaux, German columns ran into roadblocks set by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division and elements of the 9th Armored, who used the terrain to their advantage. Each bend in the road became a potential ambush, each village a strong point. By the end of the second day, Brandenburger's lead units had barely pushed beyond their start lines, and the bulk of the 7th Army remained stalled east of the rivers, unable to bring up heavy guns or supplies. The lack of mobility was decisive. With so few trucks available, supply columns stretched back for miles, vulnerable to artillery, and, once the skies cleared, to Allied fighter bombers. Horses collapsed in the snow or were shot to clear the way for vehicles. The result was a sector where the German advance never threatened to break through in force. Instead, the 7th Army became a buffer, absorbing American attention, but unable to exploit any real opportunity. The southern flank, intended as a shield for the main attack, exposed itself as a weak point, offering little support to the armored thrusts further north and opening the door to Allied counterattacks as the offensive stalled. By December 18th, American commanders recognized the vulnerability of the German southern wing. Reinforcements began arriving in strength, and the U.S. 80th Infantry Division moved to block the approaches to Bastogne from the south. Local resistance in Luxembourg, combined with the difficult terrain, further slowed the Germans. Civilians fled westward, and villages emptied as the fighting drew closer. The contrast with the chaos and confusion in the center was stark. Here, the battle settled into a grinding contest of attrition, with neither side able to achieve decisive movement. The southern sector, meant to secure the flank of Germany's last great gamble, instead became a static front, its weakness soon to be exploited as the Allies prepared their response. On December 17th, as the German offensive pressed west, the war's brutality surfaced in ways that would stain the Ardennes campaign. Near the crossroads at Baunes, outside Malmedy, men from Kampfgruppe Piper, an SS armored spearhead, captured a column of American artillery observers and support troops. The prisoners, 84 in all, were herded into a snowy field. Without warning, SS guards opened fire with machine guns and pistols. Survivors later described how the shooters moved among the bodies, finishing off the wounded at close range. News of the massacre traveled quickly among American units, hardening attitudes and fueling orders that no SS men or paratroopers would be spared if captured. Piper's column left a trail of violence through the region. At Honsfeld, Ligneville, and Wereth, more American POWs and Belgian civilians were murdered as the unit advanced. Confusion was not limited to the front lines. That same night, a different kind of threat dropped from the sky. Operation Stößer, a last-ditch paratroop mission, sent around 1,200 Fallschirmjäger under Oberst von der Heide behind Allied lines east of Malmedy. The plan was to seize the vital crossroads at Bellecroix-Jalhai and hold it for the approaching 12th SS Panzer Division. But the drop was scattered by poor weather and inexperience. Only about 300 paratroopers reached the assembly area. Lacking heavy weapons, low on ammunition, and unable to make radio contact, the group shifted to ambushes and reconnaissance, capturing a handful of prisoners and sowing rumors of a much larger force. American headquarters, already on edge from reports of German infiltrators, diverted entire regiments and an armored combat command to hunt for what they believed was a division-sized airborne assault. Meanwhile, Otto Skorzeny's Operation Greif added to the chaos. Dressed in stolen American uniforms, small teams of German commandos slipped through roadblocks, changing signposts and spreading false orders. Their numbers were tiny. Fewer than 50 men operated beyond the lines, but the psychological impact was enormous. Allied MPs interrogated drivers at checkpoints, asking baseball trivia, and state capitals to unmask imposters. Even Eisenhower was briefly confined to headquarters for his own safety. Most of Skorzeny's men were quickly captured or executed as spies, but the suspicion they left behind slowed Allied movements and deepened the sense that the front was everywhere and nowhere at once. By the end of the day, the human cost of the Ardennes was no longer measured in territory alone. The murder of prisoners, the confusion behind the lines, and the fear of betrayal changed the character of the battle. For many, the war in the snowbound forests had become a contest not just of arms, but of will and conscience. Columns of refugees began moving west as soon as the first artillery shells landed. In the villages of the Ardennes and northern Luxembourg, families packed what they could carry onto carts and bicycles, pushing through snow-covered roads alongside retreating American units. The winter of 1944 brought more than just military disaster to the region. It drove tens of thousands from their homes, many for the second time in 5 years. In Diekirch, nearly 6,000 civilians managed a southward escape over the Suur River, a rare success in an otherwise chaotic exodus. Others were less fortunate. Caught between advancing German troops and the shifting front lines, they found shelter in cellars, barns, or the ruins of their own houses, waiting for the shelling to end. For those who stayed behind, the return of German forces brought renewed fear. The Gestapo arrived with the Wehrmacht, arresting suspected resistance members and anyone accused of helping the Allies during the liberation earlier that autumn. In Luxembourg, 120 civilians were detained. 39 died in custody or were executed before the fighting moved on. The risk of reprisal was real. In some villages, those who had cheered American convoys in September now faced interrogation, or worse, for their loyalty. Yet local networks persisted, hiding downed Allied airmen and escaped prisoners despite the threat of collective punishment. The suffering was not confined to one side of the border. In Belgian towns like Houffalize and Stavelot, artillery and bombing flattened entire neighborhoods. Civilians dug through rubble for food or firewood, while livestock scattered or died in the fields. With the roads choked by retreating troops and supply columns, food shortages became acute. Some families survived on little more than potatoes and bread, sharing what they had with neighbors or strangers alike. The cold, the hunger, and the constant fear of violence pressed in on every household. Attitudes toward the occupiers were divided. In the east, some German-speaking Belgians greeted the Wehrmacht as liberators from Allied rule, while others joined resistance groups, sabotaging rail lines or guiding Allied patrols through the forests. In Luxembourg, the memory of forced conscription and deportation shaped how people responded to the new occupation. Many risked their lives to shelter American soldiers cut off by the German advance, passing food and information through secret channels that stretched from farmhouses to the edge of the front. By the time the fighting died down, the toll on civilians was staggering. Nearly 3,000 Belgians and Luxembourgers had been killed, about 3% of the population in the hardest-hit areas. Entire communities were uprooted, their homes destroyed, and their families scattered. Yet even amid the hardship, stories of solidarity and quiet resistance endured. The winter of 1944 left scars that would last for generations, but it also revealed the resilience of those who survived the battle, not with weapons, but with courage, resourcefulness, and the will to endure. Eisenhower's headquarters moved quickly as reports of the German breakthrough reached the rear. By December the 20th, the scale of the attack was clear. Orders went out to halt all offensive operations elsewhere and redirect reserves to the Ardennes. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were pulled from France and England, loaded onto trucks, and sent racing through snow-choked roads toward threatened crossroads. Within a week, over 250,000 American troops, along with British elements from 30 Corps, were pouring into the sector, reinforcing a front that had begun the battle with barely a third of that number. The Allied command structure shifted as well. German advances had severed communications between Bradley's 12th Army Group and the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies in the north. Eisenhower decided to place these armies under Field Marshal Montgomery's operational control, uniting British and American forces north of the German salient. Montgomery, visiting shattered headquarters and battered outposts, imposed order amid the confusion, repositioning units and shoring up the defense of key road networks. His approach was methodical, pulling back exposed units to more defensible lines, coordinating artillery, and gathering reserves for a counterattack. Bastogne emerged as the linchpin. 7 roads converged there, and its loss would open the way west. Eisenhower made holding Bastogne a priority. The 101st Airborne, still recovering from Holland, was rushed in by truck convoys and immediately began preparing defenses. Tanks from the 10th Armored Division joined them, plugging gaps as German columns approached from multiple directions. Supplies, fuel, and ammunition were rationed and distributed under fire. Meanwhile, engineers built roadblocks, and MPs set up checkpoints to root out infiltrators. The logistical challenge was immense. Allied supply lines, already stretched by the autumn advance, now had to support a massive redeployment in the dead of winter. Trains and convoys rolled day and night, with quartermasters requisitioning every available vehicle. Fuel and ammunition dumps were moved west, out of reach of German spearheads. The result was a growing wall of men and material across the northern shoulder, transforming what had been a patchwork defense into a solid front. By the 4th day, the initial shock had faded. American and British units dug in, artillery was massed behind the lines, and the flow of reinforcements began to slow the German advance. The Allies had regained the initiative, not through a single dramatic counterattack, but by flooding the Ardennes with fresh troops and restoring order to chaos. The focus now narrowed to Bastogne, where the outcome of the battle would soon be decided. On December the 23rd, the skies over Bastogne cleared for the first time in a week. Temperatures plunged, sunlight broke through the clouds, And for the men of the 101st Airborne, the change meant hope. Inside the besieged town, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's defenders had held out against repeated German assaults. But ammunition was running low, medical supplies were nearly gone, and rations had been cut to a single meal a day. The roads were cut in every direction. German artillery pounded the perimeter. Still, McAuliffe's reply to the German demand for surrender, just one word, nuts, had set the tone. The men dug in, waiting for relief. As the morning fog lifted, the distant drone of engines announced a new phase of the battle. Over 240 C-47 transport planes, escorted by fighters, appeared above Bastogne. In the open fields and battered streets, paratroopers watched as hundreds of canvas bundles tumbled from the sky. Between December 23rd and 27th, more than 230 tons of supplies were dropped into the town. Ammunition, medical kits, food, and radio batteries. Pathfinder teams who had parachuted in ahead of the main drop marked the landing zones with colored panels and smoke grenades. Some bundles fell into German-held ground, but most landed safely inside the American lines, where teams of medics and quartermasters raced to collect them under fire. For the defenders, the supply drops meant more than just material relief. Wounded men who had lain for days on bare floors now received morphine and bandages. Artillery crews, down to their last shells, could resume firing. Machine gunners who had counted every round were able to hold their positions. The sight of American aircraft roaring overhead after days of enemy dominance lifted morale in a way no order or speech could. Above the town, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings swept the roads and forests, hunting German columns. Bombs and rockets shattered tanks and supply trucks. Traffic jams stretched for miles behind the German lines as drivers abandoned vehicles to escape strafing runs. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which had come closest to breaking through, found its supply convoys destroyed and its reserves scattered. For the first time since the offensive began, the Germans could not move freely by day. Every attempt to mass for another assault on Bastogne drew instant attention from the air. On the ground, McAuliffe's men pressed their advantage. Patrols pushed out from the perimeter, probing for weak spots and harassing German positions. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, reinforced by a handful of Shermans, used the new supplies to repair vehicles and support counterattacks. The defenders held the Noville and Marvy sectors, repelling repeated German thrusts. Each day, the ring of fire around Bastogne grew less tight. The air bridge did not break the siege by itself, but it bought time. It kept the 101st Airborne in the fight long enough for Patton's Third Army to reach the outskirts of the town. On December 26th, tanks from the 4th Armored Division broke through the southern lines, linking up with the defenders. The relief of Bastogne was not just a tactical victory. It marked the moment when the German offensive lost its last chance for success. The initiative passed to the Allies, and the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies had faded. From that day, Bastogne stood as proof that air power, determination, and the will to resist could hold the line against the last great German attack in the West. At dawn on January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a final, desperate attempt to cripple Allied air power in Western Europe. More than 900 German aircraft took off in the early hours, targeting airfields from Brussels to Eindhoven. The attack caught many Allied squadrons off guard, destroying or damaging over 300 planes on the ground. For a few hours, the skies over Belgium and the Netherlands echoed with the sound of strafing runs and exploding fuel tanks. But the cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. By the end of the day, nearly 300 German aircraft had been lost, many to Allied fighters once the element of surprise wore off, others to anti-aircraft fire, and some to navigational errors or friendly fire. Most of the pilots shot down could not be replaced. For the Luftwaffe, Bodenplatte was a one-way mission. The Allies, with their deep reserves, quickly made up their losses. For Germany, the blow was permanent. That same day, another darker episode unfolded near the village of Chenon. After days of bitter fighting and news of German atrocities at Malmedy, men from the U.S. 11th Armored Division gathered around 80 German prisoners, mostly from the Führerbegleiter Brigade and 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, in the snow outside the village. Eyewitnesses later described how the prisoners, some medics waving white flags, were lined up in groups and machine-gunned on orders not to take any SS or paratroopers alive. No official investigation followed. High-level diaries, including Patton's, acknowledged the killings and the hope that the incident would remain concealed. No one was ever prosecuted. The massacre at Chenon remained a hidden scar, its details buried in after-action reports and the memories of those who witnessed it. Meanwhile, on the eastern horizon, the Red Army prepared for its own winter offensive. On January the 12th, Soviet forces surged across the Vistula, breaking through thin German lines and racing toward the Oder. The Wehrmacht, already battered in the Ardennes, was forced to pull its last panzer reserves from the west on January 10th, leaving the Rhineland exposed. On January 16th, American and British forces linked up at Houffalize, closing the Bulge and trapping what remained of the German spearheads. By January 28th, the U.S. command declared the battle over. The cost was staggering. German losses in the west reached nearly 100,000, killed, wounded, or missing. The Luftwaffe's last pilots were gone. American casualties approached 90,000, including 19,000 dead. Civilians in Belgium and Luxembourg had suffered as well, with thousands killed or left homeless by the fighting. The German army had spent its final reserves. The last gamble in the Ardennes brought only a few weeks' delay. With the Soviets advancing from the east and the Allies regrouping for the drive into the heart of Germany, the collapse of the Third Reich was now only a matter of time. By late January 1945, over 1 million soldiers had fought in the Ardennes, with combined casualties exceeding 185,000 on both sides. The German offensive failed to split Allied lines or seize Antwerp, and instead exhausted their last reserves. Facts documented in Allied and German war records. Evidence from Speer's armaments reports and captured Wehrmacht orders confirms that logistical shortages and fuel fantasies doomed the plan before it began. The massacre at Malmedy, the siege of Bastogne, and the Chenon atrocity are all recorded in court transcripts and military files, but the full extent of civilian suffering remains incomplete. The Battle of the Bulge exposed the limits of Nazi military power and demonstrated how weather, logistics, and rapid Allied response shaped outcomes. The battle stands as a documented turning point that accelerated Germany's defeat in World War II.